Hello, Global Hack Week. Welcome, everyone, to our Stack Overflow session. I am so excited about the guests that we have for you all here today. You're going to have the chance to ask a bunch of questions and learn more about Stack Overflow. So without further ado, I'm going to bring John onto the stream. Hello, hello.
Hi.
We've got some hellos in chat already. Well, like I said, really, really grateful to have you taking the time to join us today, and I will leave you to it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mary. And it's really a great pleasure to be here with Visual Global Hack Week. I have a pretty long history with the hackathon community, especially when I was a student during this time. So this is sort of a full circle moment for me. And I'm really honored to be able to sort of share a little bit about my story, as well as talk a little bit about what we're working on here at Stack Overflow. And of course, as you can imagine, us being sort of Stack Overflow, we like to answer questions that developers may have. So I'm going to try to leave as much time as we can possibly have for any questions that all of you might have for me about, myself, Stack Overflow, really anything that might be on your mind when it comes to, being a developer sort of in the space that we're in right now. So, we've got about, I think, the hour here. So, my plan is to basically spend about the first half or so really just talking a little bit about my story here, and also sort of talk a little bit about what Stack Overflow is working on. I'll sort of divide that up into three parts here, and then we'll leave as much time as we can for questions here. So I'll sort of start a little bit about sort of like how I became a developer in the first place, because I think that will say a little bit about how sort of hackathons have connected me to what it is that I do here, sort of how I progressed from being an entry-level developer here at Stack Overflow all the way through to currently being the director of engineering here at Stack Overflow on our main product, and then a little bit about what we've been working on over there. And I'll try to sort of leave a little nugget at the end of each of those sections before we actually get into the Q&A here. So let me just introduce myself a little bit more here. So as you probably know from some of the titles here, my name is John Chan. I go by he, him pronouns. And I'm the director of engineering for the community products team, but specifically for the public platform, which is basically the Q&A site that I think all of you are very familiar with, going to Google, getting answers to your programming questions. And I've been here, last Friday was actually my 9-year anniversary here at Stack Overflow. I actually joined as an entry-level dev here, but I'll get into that a little bit more here. So I've really seen how this company has grown over that period of time, and it's been really a really interesting journey for me to get here to this point here. So let me just start off by saying a little bit more about how I maybe became a developer here first. First thing that I think is really important to say is that I'm a self-taught dev. I didn't go to school for computer science, or I think I really only took one class when I was in college. I went to New York University and NYU, and it was to learn iOS development, because at the time it wasn't built in Swift. We didn't have React Native or React for that matter. JavaScript was something else that entirely during that time. And so when I want to learn Objective-C, the only place that I could really learn it was in class. And for some reason, it had no prerequisites. But outside of that, really didn't have a lot of hands-on instruction when it came to learning how to code. The way that I learned was because I wanted to make my Zanga and MySpace blogs, if any of you are familiar with what that is, just to make that look a little bit better. Like, I started off with learning HTML, CSS, and then eventually the JavaScript. And that's really started when I was about, I'd say, 13 or 14 years old. I always just had this really, interesting and sort of really this fascination with coding, where I can sort of put something into a computer and then see that it would actually do something. And so that really stuck with me, even though that wasn't part of my formal studies as I sort of went through to college and sort of beyond from there. And I think that's probably one of the first things that sort of has stuck with me every single time that I sort of talk about the story. And maybe one of the things that I'd like for all of you to think a little bit more about is just to keep thinking about how you're building stuff. That's really what was super motivating for me when I was sort of learning to code, trying to build my skills, eventually get into the market, and then eventually into the position that I'm in right now. I think that, the best way to learn is by actually doing things. And since all of you are so involved with hackathons and actually building stuff, learning things, coming together as teams, I think that's one of the very best ways to actually go and do that. So, for sort of my early years, I was really thinking a lot about just developing my skills as a hobby, and that continued through to college. So, like I mentioned before, went to NYU, went to New York University. I moved from where I grew up in Los Angeles over to go to New York when I was about 18 years old. And I ended up studying philosophy instead. That was really what was really interesting to me at the time. And one of the things I will say is that, like, because I was coding for so much as a hobby here, and not really taking classes other than that iOS development class that I was talking about before, I would go to some of these computer science courses that I was at and found some of that stuff interesting, right? In terms of like, oh, like how to learn about these different algorithms like Dijkstra's and what Big O is and all of that stuff. But one of the things that I found that was missing for me during that time was to find other folks who were really interested in sort of building stuff that people would actually use, or to look into the new interesting technologies that were out there, especially on the web development and the mobile front, which was what was really interesting at the time then. And I wasn't seeing that a ton inside of my classes there. And so as I sort of continued on with, being in college and continuing to sort of learn to code on my own, I ended up trying to find a community around me that was similarly interested in sort of startups and what these new web technologies were, and also thinking about hacking. And this was during a time, I think, before Major League Hacking actually had really started at that time, where you were starting to see some of these, universities actually starting to host hackathons like PenApps, MHacks, etc. And wanted to find more people to get involved in that kind of thing. And that's how I really got involved in the hackathon circuit. I think there's something really magical about sort of like having all these students sort of come together to sort of learn together as well, build a community across all these different regions and all these different schools, and possibly either, become colleagues in the future when it comes to working at the same company, or maybe even starting your own startup together there. That was something that was really exciting for me at the time, in addition to actually learning the code and all of that stuff that I was doing on the side there. And that sort of brings me to, how I actually got to Stack Overflow. So, I finished with all of that time, learning how to code on my own during school, getting a little bit more involved in the hackathon sort of circuit, and getting really involved in thinking about startups here in New York City. And I didn't go straight into a technology company right after that. I didn't really know what it is that I really wanted to do after I finished at NYU. And it ended up becoming a management consultant. I was working with a place called Deloitte Digital. They were at the time trying to really help public sector clients, basically governments, state governments, and the federal government, build out applications that were using JavaScript and using mobile. And that was cutting edge at the time. But what I found is that, I was probably one of the few management consultants that spent all of their time at a firm and didn't end up making any spreadsheets or building any PowerPoint presentations, because I was the only one that knew how to code in JavaScript with Angular and actually bolt that on top of an SAP sort of backend, essentially. And so I ended up finding that I was basically doing coding on the job, even though it wasn't necessarily a strictly engineering job that I was in. And throughout that time, while I was there for about, just shy of, I'd say, about 2 years or so, is when I was still sort of building stuff. At that time. And one of the sort of side projects that I had built then was to really solve a really interesting question that's kept coming to me from other folks who were trying to learn how to code, which was like, well, how'd you be self-taught in the first place, right? This is before there were a lot of YouTube videos that were out there, or Twitch streams where you could actually watch people actually code. And so people would constantly ask me, where did you actually learn? What resources do you use? And so I remember one night, this is actually a few nights before the MHacks that for that particular year, I think back in 2000, and I want to say 2014, I pulled together, all the different resources that I could learn to code for free. Some of them were Code Academies, some of them were YouTube videos, some of them were W3 Schools tutorials as well, about like, these are 2 best places to learn HTML, these are the 2 best places to learn CSS, JavaScript, Angular, all that stuff. Put it inside of a JSON file in GitHub and put an Angular front end on top of it using GitHub Pages. And I posted it on Hacker News the next day, actually the morning before I went to MHacks that time. And in half an hour, I found that the link that I shared for this site that I built called Bento got to #1 on the front page of Hacker News. And I was getting a ton of attention for it just because of this side project that I had built. And I remember going to actually help out with MHACs. I wasn't necessarily a participant, but I was there to sort of help out and support because I was still very involved in that even after I graduated. I thought to myself, oh, well, if it's doing well on Hacker News, maybe it'll do well on Reddit too. And I remember posting it, I think it was on R Technology. It was one of the main subreddits at the time. And it got to the front page of Reddit too on the same day. And so I think I got something on the order of several 100,000 hits on that first day. I think it was getting close to a million. One of the smart things I remember doing that I did was actually put in my LinkedIn at the very top of that. So I ended up getting a ton of emails and calls from places that were interested in the work that I was doing. And one of those folks, one of those companies happened to be Stack Overflow at the time. About 2-3 weeks after that particular sort of crazy time, I had an offer in hand and I've basically joined as an entry-level developer. And I've been here sort of ever since. So, that's a winding sort of journey for me to sort of how I got here at Stack Overflow, especially as a self-taught dev that maybe didn't have as traditional of a background. I think that I've heard this kind of story. And in fact, I think I'm hearing this kind of story more and more as there are more people that are sort of joining the technology industry sort of overall here. Having a 4-year degree is certainly one way, sort of the most time-tested, battle-tested sort of ways to get into this industry and to learn the skills that you're going to need to be successful. But there are so many other paths and avenues to becoming a developer. And, there are some of the things that I think that I've learned from my own journey has really been about like this really, this commitment to building stuff that I found that was interesting, trying to figure out how to be really good at the skill of learning itself, right? I think that's a really big part of what it is, what it means to be an engineer. And then eventually just trying to make your own luck, right? Like I just try to keep opening doors for myself, either by getting involved in hackathons or joining extracurricular clubs that are really into startups. Even if I wasn't in a traditional 4-year degree program, that's how I ended up getting the job here at Stack Overflow. And I think that those kinds of avenues and opportunities are open to more people these days. So that's sort of how I got to Stack Overflow. I do want to talk a little bit too about sort of what the story was like, or what the path was like for me to go from essentially an entry-level developer that didn't have an engineering job before that. I didn't even have a technical internship before I joined Stack Overflow, and how I eventually moved to become senior, and then eventually now leading the engineering team for our core product here. I've been here for, I just hit 9 years last Friday, so it's been a long journey. But during those 9 years, I felt like I've transformed a lot, and also this company has transformed with me. The Stack Overflow, if you can imagine what it was like before Stack Overflow actually existed, has only been around for a little over 10 years here. And so I joined during a time when it was still quite early. I remember, I'm sitting in the office right now here in New York City, where our headquarters is, and I remember moving into this office when there was basically nothing that was here. There wasn't even art on the walls just yet. And so I was joining an environment that was really scrappy at the time, right? There weren't even other senior titles for engineer. They were all just like, everyone's just a software developer. I remember the onboarding for myself during that time was like, here's a computer, figure out how to like download .NET and learn C#. By the way, I didn't know C# or .NET during that time. I was mostly a Python, Flask, Mongo kind of guy working on a Mac. I basically switched on every major technology war that you can imagine, from like dynamic to static and going from Mac to actually Windows and all that stuff. So I was thrown in pretty quickly into deep water here. And not only that, but there were tons of developers here that were, really well known in the industry. I mean, the way that Stack Overflow was recruiting a lot of developers at the time was to basically take a look at who had the most reputation and who was the most, most active on our site here. And the nature of Stack Overflow being what it is, that meant that we were bringing in some really incredible developers that were sort of masters of C# and .NET that really understood the ecosystem really well. And so when I first joined here, it was a very intimidating experience to sort of come in as a self-taught dev that didn't know the technologies, in a place that didn't have a lot of structure, and surrounded by a lot of people that were very, very good at what it is that they were doing. Fortunately, and I hope that this is the case for all of you once you actually really start getting into this industry or hopefully early on in your career, I did find that it was a very supportive community around me. And the people that were around me were really willing to sort of help me sort of grow, well, not only as a developer, but also as just someone who was working on a team. And that's one of the things that I sort of want to impart to everybody that sort of hears a little bit more about my story here, and something that I tell all of my devs when they sort of join the team and they're thinking about how to progress themselves, is that it's really not just about the technology. Once you actually get into an engineering sort of role here or join a company here, sure, that stuff is important. Really getting really good at programming and understanding the technology and how to build features and even start about building a product, right? In a startup sort of situation, those technical skills are really important. But I'd say that, as I've sort of seen more and more developers get into the team and talk to other people who are thinking about building engineering sort of organizations or building companies, the other half of this, where you're able to sort of work really well with other people here and collaborate with them and learn from them and also share what it is that you're learning as well, is just as important, if not more important than the actual technical skills here. For a lot of you who may have not have, had a lot of experience building stuff outside of an academic sort of setting here, a lot of the time you're probably just, there's a fresh new problem where there's no existing code and you can just go ahead and start working on something. It's almost never the case when you're actually starting to work on an engineering team. There's always pre-existing code. You're always going to have to work with other people here. And in fact, there is maybe no documentation, certainly maybe no questions on Stack Overflow about how this particular feature for this particular company that you're working on is going to help answer for you. And so being able to sort of be resourceful and lean on the expertise and the help of other people around you, especially on your team, is going to be an extremely critical skill. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that, Stack Overflow has really tried to embody that as a value is, we want everybody as a developer to grow and to build their technical skills, but to do that through the knowledge of other people that really sort of want to collaborate and build a repository of knowledge. So, even though it was intimidating when I first started off here at Stack Overflow, I found that the team and the community that was around me and also this willingness and this commitment to sort of help other people get better was really what allowed me to sort of continue growing from there. In terms of outside of sort of like what the feeling was like sort of joining here, what was I actually working on? I started off as an entry-level dev, like I said before, working on our talent product at the time. So there was a product on Stack Overflow, unfortunately no longer there anymore, where we were actually helping developers find jobs or internships with other companies. That was the very first thing I worked on. I remember working on the geocoder. That was one of my very first projects when I came there, which is basically like, give me a string, like when you're searching for a job in New York City, for example, and turn that into a latitude and a longitude. That was one of the very first projects that I was really interested in. Of course, that ended up being a lot bigger than I was expecting, like it usually is when it comes to projects. But very quickly after that, I'd say about 2 or 3 years, I started getting really involved in more of the sort of marketing sort of portions of this. This was a time when I was still very interested in sort of learning how new technologies on my own and actually still being involved in a lot of like student organizations and on the hackathon circuit as well. So I wanted to see if I could do something on the marketing side. So I remember rebuilding our blog using Jekyll, for example, at the time, and moving it away from WordPress, and also thinking about how revenue attribution could actually happen for, when we actually did a campaign, how much revenue did that actually make for us at the time? And so I was really interested in thinking about, well, how do we actually put forward what the brand of Stack Overflow is going to be, and also think a little bit more about what the systems were going to be. That all lasted, I'd say, about 3 or 4 years. But the thing that I really wanted to work on at the time was really the core of what Stack Overflow is, the Q&A site that most of us actually know. Here at Stack Overflow, all of our developers still use it too. And so eventually, I'd say about 4 years ago was really, or no, sorry, about 4 years in is when I actually moved onto the core Q&A team. And one of the things that was really interesting during that time, by that time I'd become a senior developer. I was really interested in sort of how to think about expanding the scope of what Stack Overflow could be during that time. It's mostly been Q&A. I really wanted to sort of see what it would mean to sort of bring in and make it easier for self-taught developers to sort of come in, people from all sorts of different backgrounds as well. And that's really what has continued up until this day. And I'd say that the big shift that happened once I actually joined the core Q&A team was really starting to think a little bit less about what my contributions could be individually as a developer here, but really think about how I can help other people around me become better developers. Again, sort of going back to what I was talking about before, where the technical skills are important, but the ability to sort of actually work with other people and sort of help other people becomes more and more important, especially as you sort of progress in your career here. So eventually, about I'd say about 5 to 6 years after I joined Stack Overflow, I eventually ended up becoming a principal engineer here as well. So going from entry level to principal and really thinking a lot, not only about my technical skills, but really thinking about how I can actually grow the skills of the people who are around me, really think about being a leader during that time. And so I'd say, that's where I was, how I sort of progressed as an individual contributor, but switching into management was a whole other thing here too, which is something that really started about 4 years ago at this point, 3 or 4 years ago. And that was also a big shift as well. Now went from a place where some of my time was coding and a lot of it was sort of thinking about leadership and working with other people, to my entire all of my time being spent really thinking about working with people and thinking about working on teams here and building those teams. And that's a very big shift. A lot of people, I think about like, oh, as I become more and more of a senior engineer, it's natural that I become a manager after. But that isn't always the case, and it actually usually isn't always the best thing to do. It's, in a lot of ways, I think it's actually switching careers in a lot of ways, where you're doing less and less of the technology work. That's really what you're thinking about on a day-to-day basis as a software engineer, instead of going into management or to leadership, where you're really thinking a lot more about cultures and teams and people. When I was an engineer, most of my time was hands-on keyboard, and that's how it is that I really want to be able to spend my time. Once I got into management, I don't code anymore. It's turned into this really funny sort of like full circle moment where now that I'm a manager and managing engineering teams, I don't code almost so much on the job anymore. It's sort of become a hobby for me again, where I actually build side projects outside of work. And so, I sort of continued doing that over the last several years, where eventually I became director of engineering here at Stack Overflow. And now my job is to think less and less sort of about how each individual team is sort of working, but really what does the future of Stack Overflow look like from a product perspective, and also sort of how we think about how technologies are going to enable a lot of the future of what Stack Overflow is going to be later on, not just in the next few months, but in the next several years, for example. And so that's really what my journey is sort of like, going from entry level all the way to, where I am right now as director of engineering, and how the responsibilities that I've had have really sort of shifted to where we are sort of today here. So enough about me. I already talked for 20 minutes about myself here. I do want to say a little bit about what we're doing at Stack Overflow right now, and where I think that could be very relevant for each of you to sort of get more involved here. So, I think that the vast majority, it's no real secret or surprise that, the core Q&A product itself has not evolved significantly since it really first started. It's still largely questions, answers, thinking a lot about how to make sure that you get the value out of the questions and the answers that are on this sort of knowledge repository that are there. And it's been very successful for us up until this time. And one of the things that we're starting to think more and more about is like, well, what are the other ways that people can actually learn? And besides just using Q&A, right? It's not like you're just going to Stack Overflow, for example, to learn how to, say, use Python for the first time. You're probably using a diversity of different resources that are. Sometimes there's videos, sometimes there's blog posts, sometimes it's tutorials, or maybe Twitch streams and YouTube videos. How do we start thinking about actually pulling all of those different kinds of resources together in a more coherent way, so that we can go beyond what just Q&A is going to be there when you are running into a bug and you actually need to get a question answered, for example. So that's sort of the direction that we're sort of going in here. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the projects that we've been doing to sort of explore what that sort of looks like. I mean, one of them is still thinking about the core Q&A experience, right? One of the interesting things that we've been doing a lot lately is a lot of experimentation on how we actually help people discover answers on Stack Overflow. That seems to be the core value that a lot of people get out of coming to the site here. And so trying to figure out like, hey, maybe there was a question that was answered 5 years ago about, say, JavaScript, right? And there was the perfect answer for that particular question about JavaScript, but because it was written 5 years ago, it's gotten the most upvotes, even though there might have been a new answer that could have given would have been a better answer for that question. So we've been running a ton of experiments lately about to see, well, could we actually make that answer go to the top so that a user can actually find it more quickly here. And not only that, but how can we run other experiments to see if maybe other questions are more relevant for somebody who's going to be looking for a particular answer to some sort of problem they're running into? Are there ways that we can use machine learning as well to maybe help people get an answer faster here, or be able to help even craft answers? That might be something that we're going to be exploring, I think, sometime in the future here too. So those are some of the ideas that we're sort of looking into, in addition to sort of thinking about how we're going to bring in all these other mediums or all these other resources that are out there for learning here that go sort of beyond Q&A. So that's a little bit about what it is that we're doing at Stack Overflow. I can say a little bit more about that as we get into questions and answers. But like I said, I want to leave as much time for any questions that we've got here. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about what we're actually doing here at Stack Overflow. And I really want to hear a lot more about what you all want to learn here as well. It's funny. Thank you for that comment, Star. It's funny. We have this joke here at Stack Overflow where it's like, oh, Stack Overflow went down. Like, how are we going to bring Stack Overflow back up if we can't use Stack Overflow anymore? That's how much we actually use it. That's just a joke, by the way. We do know how to bring that back up again, but I think it speaks a ton to how we actually do development here and how we think about, what we're actually doing for the developer community. Oh, I think that this might be about, I have a question here about what was the site like, what did it do? I'm wondering if this maybe could be about the side project that I was working on. So if this was about the side project, it was a site called Bento. You can actually still go to it, bento.io. It's not nearly as well maintained as it was in the past year, but it was really about bringing sort of like free coding resources, the best free coding resources that I could find about each topic, each major topic, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, Angular, machine learning, whatever it could be, and just put it up on there, made the data open source, and I allowed sort of people to sort of track their progress through it. So sort of like a self-study guide if you wanted to be a self-taught developer. That's what the site was, and that was called Bento. So bento.io is where you can actually still go and check it out. And that's the thing that actually got me to come to Stack Overflow in the first place. All right, have another question here. So let's see. Will we have a time in the future when SO profiles will be looked at by recruiters looking to hire, like they look at your GitHub profiles right now? So are we consider moving in that direction? So I think that this is actually already happening. This has actually been a big part of what certainly how we sort of hire here at Stack Overflow. But people sort of use their ability to gain reputation or to ask questions and to build a following on Stack Overflow as a really useful tool to find opportunities for themselves in the job market. In the past, when we actually had a jobs product here, that was a really big part of how we made sure that recruiters would actually see whether or not a particular candidate was going to be good for the role that they were sort of looking to fill here. But since we sunsetted that, we still think about how profiles can be used to sort of develop a reputation for yourself more broadly, not just sort of like within Stack Overflow here. And I think, like I was saying before, as we start to think about more diverse ways of helping people learn how to code or to get answers to their programming questions, I think that the profile and the ability for somebody to create content and show the impact that they're making on Stack Overflow is going to become more and more prominent. And that's definitely something that I think that you can take to a recruiter in the future. All right, are students outside of the North America region eligible for the Stack Overflow Student Ambassador Program? That's a great question. I don't know that answer right off the top of my head, but I'll make sure that we can get that information back out to everybody once we're wrapped up over here. All right, question here. Ever resolve your bug for Stack Overflow by using the solution on Stack Overflow? Yes, absolutely, all the time. We still try to follow best practices whenever we're talking about, actually using Stack Overflow resources. For example, like we wouldn't just straight up copy and paste something and just use it without checking how it's going to work. I know that actually ends up happening a lot of the times. There have been some really interesting stories in the past that I think I've seen on the news about people having to do like recalls of products, or they had to change what the software has been for how like a car works because they found that they could actually just straight up copy and paste stuff from Stack Overflow, and they found that there were some comments that they could trace to a specific question where the code was actually broken there. So yes, we do actually use Stack Overflow on a regular basis to actually address the bugs that we have here. Just like every other developer does. But, I would caution anybody that's just straight up copying and pasting stuff here. We know what happens, but you still want to make sure that you understand how things are working there. All right. Actually, I do have an answer here for the previous question about whether or not student ambassadors can come from outside North America here. So currently, those that are outside of North America and Canada aren't eligible to be on-campus ambassadors for like the Pizza Fund and all of that stuff. But we would love engaging with you sort of like in the future here for Global Hack Week. Who knows? We may actually end up changing that sometime soon. Who knows? But for now, they're not eligible right now. Oh, question here. How is Stack Overflow named? This is actually a great question here. So we actually have the community decide what Stack Overflow should be named. So this is, for those of you that don't know, our co-founders, Jeff Atwood and Joel Spolsky, both of them were really big in sort of the blogging space, when Stack Overflow was being started over 10 years ago. And so they had a pretty significant following by the time that we actually started Stack Overflow as a product. And one of the things that they actually ended up doing on Stack Overflow was, why don't we ask people what we should actually be named and see what the community actually thought and actually see if there would be votes on how it should be named. And that's how we actually ended up with it. That's also how we came up with the logo as well. I think that we had people submit designs and then we picked one at the end. And then that was how we actually started when it comes to our branding. All right. Question over here. So any plans for dealing with AI generated massive upsurge in confidently incorrect posts here? So let me just sort of speak about AI sort of generally here. So this is and sort of like what we might be doing about this in the future here. So, a lot of the tools that are out there right now when it comes to artificial intelligence or machine learning, especially for the things that are like large language models that seem to be able to do things like take a question and see if you can actually answer it, or to flesh out a particular piece of text that's there. That's something that's really interesting and really relevant, I think, for what it is that we're doing here at Stack Overflow. In terms of concrete plans to sort of deal with, posts that are being actually generated by AI, no news on that just yet. It's certainly something that's on our mind, but I'd say stay tuned to hear a little bit more about that in the future. All right, I have another question here about the Student Ambassador Program, about when the next batch of applications will be open there. I'll make sure that one of my colleagues sort of follows up with that about that, but we'll circle back to that particular question there in terms of logistics there. All right, other questions here. This is a great question. So the question is, what do people use before Stack Overflow? What do people use before Stack Overflow to solve their bugs? I can speak a little bit to this because I do remember what it was like coding before Stack Overflow existed here. And it's a lot of what you might have expected during that time. I mean, for me, I learned a lot about how to code from actually reading books, like I think I still have, like my PHP, Linux, Apache, MySQL book somewhere in my bedroom back home. But that's how I learned how to, code during that time, was to literally go to the bookstore and buy a physical book, or go to the library and try to figure out, how to get myself out of a particular bind. And that's how I would have done it from, like, I guess the closest analog to sort of what we have with Stack Overflow, where it's like there's a pre-existing written knowledge that's out there somewhere. Where do I go and find that information? Well, that was in books and libraries. But the other way that I ended up trying to solve bugs during that time was to ask other people who were actually, working on similar problems there. And some of you might be familiar with like RC or chat, very similar, I guess, to a lot of the kind of communities that you're seeing much more with like Discord and things like that. There are precursors to that too before Stack Overflow existed. Chat's been around for a very, very long time as a technology. And one of the main ways that chat was being used for the people that were using it before it really became mainstream around that time was to actually get answers to their programming questions at the time. And I think you're starting to see a lot of that sort of come back in that way, especially with the rise of things like Discord again. So it seems like a lot of things that were old are sort of new again. All right. Actually, just want to get back to the previous question here about sort of when the next batch is going to be. So there's going to be new communication soon along with Major League Hacking about plans to open up new applications for the next semester. So we'll talk a little bit more about this very, very soon, and we'll come up with what that's going to look like. All right. Do you have any book recommendations? So about programming specifically, let's see. Not recently, I'd say about programming. So a lot of the books that I've been actually been reading lately has been largely around productivity, actually, or sort of thinking about how to make good decisions. Again, one of the things that I have sort of switched over into thinking more and more about is sort of like how teams are built or how software should be built from a sort of organizational perspective. And so you could say a little bit about that in terms of book recommendations. But I think another one that might be really interesting to talk about is, what I've been thinking about in terms of like individual productivity there as well. Because, one of the things that I remember thinking a lot about when I was an individual contributor and as an engineer was to be like, well, how can I be the best developer I possibly could be, either by getting better at coding or thinking about how to make better decisions over here. And the thing that I've been talking to my team a lot about lately is how to make sure that you're taking care of yourself as a person outside of just your, sharpening your technical skills here too. So, I just had this conversation with a developer that's been on my team about like feeling like they're maybe working more hours than they should be in terms of like, I don't want people to be working beyond the hours they actually should be, and it's starting to like affect their sleep, for example, or their productivity over there. So was recommending them books. Like one of them is like Why We Sleep, which is talking about like how important it is that that's going to be for, basically everything when it comes to your health and when it comes to like your ability to actually think meaningfully about coding, which is a creative thing. You need to be able to have a good amount of space to be thinking about really hard technical problems. You need to make sure that the foundation of you as a person is going to be really strong there too. So interestingly enough, the thing I've been talking to by engineers about is like, how are you taking care of yourself fully as a person here in terms of like, are you getting enough sleep? Are you not working yet? Are you working beyond the hours that you should be? How are we preventing burnout here? That's something that I think a lot of people are sort of thinking about. Another book from the more organizational sort of perspective here that I think might be really interesting for other people to think about here too is like Principles by Ray Dalio, is something that I've been really interested in here lately too. And it's sort of talking a lot about how do you think about basically what your goals are going to be and turn that into meaningful sort of principles or rules about how to sort of like make decisions, especially in a business context over here. I highly recommend both of those books, even though they may not be directly about programming, but sort of are more general purpose about like how to think about your productivity, your health, and also how to make good decisions. I think those are going to be skills that you take with you, regardless of what sort of technical direction that you're going to be taking, or even if you're going to be thinking about moving into management in the future. Is SO still on .NET? I think that's about .NET. So the short answer is yes. We are still largely still a Microsoft stack here. So C#, .NET, Microsoft SQL Server. Thinking about using Azure more and more, for example. So largely a really very much a Microsoft technology shop that we are. In the future, we might sort of explore what it would look like for us to bring on other technologies in the future here, especially as we think about shifting what our architecture is going to look like. But currently, it's still very much a Microsoft shop through and through. So this is a question about the industry, but predictions about junior dev hiring over the next few months. Outlook still bleak for recent bootcamp grads. So I'll say a little bit about what I think the hiring market is sort of going through and how that's sort of relevant for folks who are just breaking into the industry and maybe what you can do to sort of navigate that. Right now is a very turbulent time when it comes to what the market is sort of looking like right now, not just for the technology industry, even though the technology industry has been impacted, I'd say, disproportionately compared to the rest of the the market that we're sort of seeing here. But the thing is that engineers are still largely in demand, sort of overall, right? The overall trends when it comes to how much folks are still hiring, even if you take a look, for example, let's say a lot of the places that have been doing reductions, they're still hiring in a lot of different ways. So maybe not in the same sort of functions that they were sort of operating in the past year, but the opportunities are still there, even if it may seem like the market is sort of contracting. I mean, one of the things that we're doing here at Stack Overflow is that we are still hiring. We are not slowing down when it comes to something like that, even if we're in a fraction of the size of some of these other companies that you may be hearing about that are doing sort of contractions in the news right now. And so when it comes to overall industry outlook about what opportunities are sort of out there, I think they're still going to be there. Are they going to be a little bit harder to find? Sure, especially given where things are in the industry sort of overall, but they're going to be there, and I'd say in pretty comparable sort of like numbers here. In fact, I know that a lot of the people who are still hiring during this time are really looking to try to pick up a lot of the folks that maybe are going through a transition right now. And so you may find that there's actually quite a lot of activity right now when it comes to actually hiring during this period. That's what I've seen before. When we've actually seen market contractions every sort of like 5 to 8 years is when we sort of see something like this. And that's when there's a lot of sort of opportunity in addition to a lot of change during that time here. And so that's what my sort of overall thoughts are on the industry as a whole when it comes to the hiring market. Specific sort of advice or observations about how this might affect folks who are more junior or to maybe recent boot camp grads that are coming out of this. My advice for all of you is still largely the same for basically anybody that might be looking for a job here, which is like you can sort of like go through the typical process here of like looking on job boards and trying to find where the right job listings are going to be and then applying for them and going forward like that. And you can do that, right? But then you'll be sort of getting into a situation where maybe you're sort of applying with the rest of everybody else. And, as a junior dev or somebody that maybe doesn't have as much experience as some of the other candidates might have when that time actually comes, you might get lost in the candidate pool when it actually ends up happening. And so the advice that I give to basically anybody, but especially more junior devs, is to really flex your network here. I can speak for myself as a manager that when I'm thinking about hiring for something, it's not like I suddenly thought about it the moment that the job posting actually went up. I've been thinking about hiring for that particular role for some time. Even if we were to say start an internship program here at Stack Overflow, we would be thinking about that for a very, very long time. And so your ability as a junior dev or somebody who's in a boot camp or has recently finished a boot camp, my advice to you is to start reaching out to people at the companies that you think you might want to work at in the future here, and just start sort of sowing the seeds for relationships that are there. It's not like if you get onto a Zoom call with maybe a manager or an engineer or a recruiter from a particular company that you really want to work at, that they're going to be like, oh, perfect. Like this is the exact perfect time for me for you to reach out and have this conversation. I can hand you a job offer right now. Like that doesn't happen very much, but just like any other relationship, starting off and getting like, hey, I'm really interested in sort of the work that you are doing at Stack Overflow or any of these other companies that are sort of out there. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about the culture. People want to be able to talk about that kind of thing, especially if they're someone who really enjoys the work that they're doing at the place that they're at here. And so getting advice from those people and developing a relationship like that, just starting off, is always a good place to start, so that when those opportunities do come, you actually have a leg up before almost anybody that actually sees a job listing for something like that. And having that relationship and having an advocate for yourself inside of any of those companies that you want to be able to work at is always going to be helpful there. So my advice is to take the less sort of beaten path or the less obvious path when it comes to trying to find a job here. Don't just go to the job boards. Don't just keep taking your application and sort of applying to as many as you possibly can and seeing what sticks. Be a bit more targeted and try to actually do that through the relationships that you're going to be building. And that will be to make you much more successful than it would if you were to take the alternative approach here. Ooh, this is a great question. So this is about what challenges and maybe strengths that I think that self-taught devs generally have. I've been asked this question a few times here, and the way that I like to think about this is that thinking about all the different, the different ways that people can sort of get into software engineering as, a job or a profession here. in the past, I sort of talked about, or, when I first started off talking about sort of my journey to become an engineer here, I talked about it, being a self-taught dev. And one of the things that I was really good at during that time was building stuff and actually being able to focus on delivering something of value there. I think that's one of the really amazing strengths about being a self-taught dev, is that you can be very self-driven. You are very resourceful when it comes to how you actually pick up knowledge in places that maybe other people wouldn't have been able to, right? Not just sort of looking only on Stack Overflow, but maybe also reading the documentation once in a while and looking at really interesting places like on videos, or talking to other people because you develop a really strong network here, or finding other creative ways of getting the answers that you need. Like, I think that's one of the things that being a self-taught dev really gets you when it comes to, leg ups when being an engineer here. But that's not the only path that's there, right? And I also want to avoid saying that that's the best way to become a developer. That's just one of many ways to do that. The other two that I sort of think about here are really the sort of like institutional 4-year degree programs and sort of like boot camps that are there. That's sort of been the most recent sort of addition to sort of the different paths that you can get into becoming an engineer. For the 4-year traditional degree program, the thing that's really helpful for them is that, they have a lot of this academic understanding around sort of like I was saying before, data structures, algorithms, time and space complexity considerations, really sophisticated academic research that's there, right? But maybe they haven't actually had the experience of building something that people actually use, for example, or working on a team, right? Maybe if you're spending a lot of your time reading and maybe not doing as many sort of like group projects or working on something that people are going to use, that's going to be very different from somebody who's self-taught that maybe has built something that a lot of people use. But similarly, they may not have actually gotten a lot of help sort of learning in a group setting, which is what you're going to be doing in an engineering organization. And that brings me to sort of the bootcamp portion of this. Bootcamp grads similarly may feel like they don't have the same academic sort of like backing as, say, someone who went through a 4-year degree program. And they may also feel like, oh, well, I haven't built anything sort of useful during that time that people have actually used, like the people who are self-taught. But some of the advantages that you get from being in a bootcamp sort of scenario is that you get a lot of the practical sort of industry sort of advice that you would get as a result of that. Like, you don't learn sort of on-the-job skills nearly as deeply in an academic setting, certainly not so much when you're self-taught, unless you got into some opportunity where you were able to do that. But in a bootcamp grad situation, you get a lot of the industry knowledge that is sort of distilled from all of these people that have been in the industry that created these curriculums. And also you're focusing on the really relevant technologies that you might need to actually get into the industry. And you're probably doing that in a group setting as well. But similarly, they feel like they don't maybe have the same academic backing. They may not feel like they have the experience of building stuff. Each path is different. They each have their trade-offs here. So none of them are particularly better than the other. Maybe in some situations they would be. But when it comes to self-taught devs, I really think that it's how resourceful you can be when it comes to learning, that you have some experience actually building products on your own that maybe you don't get from the other two paths before you actually get into your first job. Ooh, good question. Tips preventing burnout. So this is something that's become really relevant, as you can imagine, especially in the last few years. There's a lot of change that's been happening, in the last few years here, and burnout is a big question that I think a lot of people are having here. My thoughts on burnout here are a few here. I mean, the first thing that I really want to talk about is, I think a lot of people think about burnout as having too much work, right? Like there's too much on your plate here, and you're finding that you're working more hours than you should be, and then eventually that's what's going to burn out. And that may very well be the case, right? Maybe you really do, in fact, have just too much on your plate here, and you're not sort of able to meet the commitments that you feel like you need to, and you're sort of sacrificing your well-being in order to do that. That's, I think, the way that most people sort of think about burnout. And again, it can certainly be the case for you. But I think that there are a number of other factors that you also need to be thinking about when it comes to what might be contributing to burnout. And one of the other things that I think a lot about too is how valuable and connected do you feel about the work that you are getting here? Because there are some people that have a ton on their plate, but they're not feeling burnt out because they're really enjoying the work that they are doing, and they feel really passionate about the work that they are doing here, right? Here at Stack Overflow, part of the reason that I think I've stayed here for such a long time is because I'm very committed to What the mission here is at Stack Overflow to sort of drive a lot of the access to programming knowledge to as many people as possible, especially people from underrepresented backgrounds or folks that may come from non-traditional backgrounds like myself. And so that can mean that I maybe take on a lot of work, but I may not have the same sort of like danger of burning out than someone who doesn't feel very connected to their work. So maybe it's not just the volume of what it is that you're doing, but how connected do you feel to what it is that you are doing there? And if you sort of think about it from that perspective, there's a lot of different things that could be contributing to both of those things. One could be the volume. Maybe you're not delegating enough or asking enough for help here. Maybe this isn't the right mission for you when it comes to the kind of work that you want to be able to do here. And then outside of that, just thinking about things that make you feel good overall. Like I mentioned earlier, like this book about like sleep. I can't tell you like how much I've been thinking about that in the last few years here, because it's so foundational to everything that I'm doing in my life here. Really making sure that I get not just work stuff, but making sure that my health is good, that my relationships are strong, that I'm doing things and hobbies that are just for fun, that don't need to be a side hustle, right? Those are all things that can sort of help stay the tide when it comes to feeling burnt out or something like that. So yes, it might actually be about the volume of work that you're taking on, but I would challenge anybody who's thinking about this to consider all the other factors that may be getting into it, right? Try to, stress test what it is that's actually causing some of those feelings there. Is it the value? Is it your health? Is it your relationships? Or is it really about the volume that you're taking on? All right, so what are the main things you would focus on in a project to stand out from others? So I'm assuming that this is about sort of like creating a project to get the attention of, say, maybe like a recruiter, or to, maybe like do a startup or something else like that. When I was working on Bento, I didn't have this in mind, by the way. A lot of this sort of came after the fact when I got a lot of attention for it. I mean, one and probably the most obvious thing about this is to make sure that you're writing good code. I mean, I think that a lot of people, when they're doing solo projects, can feel like they are going to be writing something and they accrue a lot of technical debt, or they take shortcuts about how they might actually end up doing that. And especially if you are going to be doing something that's open source or anything like that, you want to be able to demonstrate that like you can write good code that is neat, maybe well commented or documented, as well as following best practice over here. Whenever anybody puts their GitHub or puts something where I can actually see their code on their resume or their application when they're applying for a job here, I always look at it. I will dig through what it is that they've actually posted on there. And if you're putting it on your resume, you should be feel pretty confident that I would find it interesting, that it demonstrates your skills here too. Same thing goes for when you're answering questions on Stack Overflow, right? Like I will go take a look at what it is that you've asked on Stack Overflow to see if you're, have the sort of expertise, or at least framing the understanding of what it is that you have when you're asking a question, to see what you're thinking about there. And even if you have a personal blog, I'm also going to be looking at that. So first thing, make sure that your code is good and that you're demonstrating that whatever is visible out there, or whatever sort of supporting documentation you have about a project is at the standard with which you sort of want to put your best foot forward, right? That's one thing. The second thing that I think I would talk about is usage. Like, the fact that somebody is actually using the thing that you are building there also shows not only your technical ability, but also your business acumen, right? We don't hire folks, or not a lot of places hire folks that are just hands on keyboard coding and not thinking about what the business is doing, or what the organization needs, or what our users are thinking about. It's always in service to something that you are trying to accomplish, and a lot of the time it's for who's actually using your product, right? So if you're building a product and there are people who are actually using it, maybe not a ton of people, right, but that there is some significant usage there, that's a really good sign there too. So if you're thinking about a side project where maybe it's like a small trinket, or a resource, a learning resource like I built out too, being able to demonstrate that people are actually using it, or that you can sort of maintain a user base, is also a really good thing to show when you're actually thinking about a project to stand out from other folks. Yeah, great question. So as a manager, do I code anymore? And if not, do I miss it? So as a manager on my day job, no, I don't code very much, if at all, at this point. I still have technical conversations, right? Like I don't think that a lot of managers or leaders of engineers would be very successful if they didn't understand the technology or the code or what it is that they were talking about. Especially, I think, at a place that really values coding and development and thinking about technology like Stack Overflow does. So no, I don't code anymore, but I do have a lot of those conversations, largely about things like, say, large architecture questions or how to choose which technology or what investments we need to make to be paying down technical debt. Those are conversations that I have on a regular basis, if not constantly, right? So even though I'm not coding, I'm still thinking a lot about the technology. I do code outside of work, though. And a big part of that, too, is because, one, it's been a hobby for my entire life. So I don't know if I'm ever going to get to a place where I don't code anymore at all. And if I miss it, sure, sometimes. I mean, I spend a lot of my time in meetings these days. That's basically what it is that I do on a regular basis now. And so, do I wish that I had maybe a little bit more downtime to build out something? Sure, but I can do that outside of work too. And who knows? Maybe one day, if I really want to get back to it, you can always switch back to it. I know a lot of people that have been managers that have actually gone back to being individual contributors where they can actually code again, just because that's what they found that they enjoy a lot more here. So, yeah, that's what it's been. All right. Oh, interesting. So this is a good question. So is it better to focus on one tool or skill per project, or is it better to highlight several in a single project? So here's the thing. This kind of reminds me of this question that I get from people about, oh, what language should I use and master when I'm first starting to learn how to code? Like, should I learn Python and just do Python, or should I use JavaScript and just use that? What should I do there? Or should I just learn all of them? When I think about these different technologies, they're tools in a box, right? And the way that I sort of think about it too is that when you're building an application, whether that's a mobile app or some sort of project that you're thinking about here, you're kind of building a house, right? And so to answer the question about sort of like, well, should you be using just one tool or should you be using as many as you possibly can here? It's kind of neither. You want to be able to use the right tools for the right job here. And so basically what you want to like, if you're building a web application, you should use the actual tools that are going to be useful for that project. Like, and especially be able to demonstrate that you have expertise and solid foundations for it. So for me at the time when I was building Mento, it was like JavaScript, HTML, Angular, Git. That's what it was. No more or no less, because that's what I needed for the project over here. I made sure that the code was good, especially because it was open source at the time. And I thought that people might contribute to it. But that's really what helped, I think, get the attention of certain folks that were there. When you're building a house, same thing. You're only using the tools that you really need to build the house. There's no point in, I don't know, using a jackhammer if you don't need it, if you're going to be laying down the foundation for a floor here. But the same thing goes where you're not just going to use a hammer to build a house. Like, that would be very hard to do. You maybe could do it, but that's not the only thing that you want to be able to do here. So use the right tools for the right job, focus on the quality of the work that you were doing, and the rest will sort of come through. All right. Do hackathon projects help in getting dev opportunities? I say yes, absolutely. When I was talking earlier about sort of like, oh, well, what are the different sort of like trade-offs when it comes to being a 4-year degree, sort of like track versus self-taught versus sort of going into boot camp here. Like I was saying before, having a diversity of experience is really what sort of lets you compensate for some maybe of the weaknesses that you have of taking one particular track or one particular road here. So, for a lot of people that are in the hackathon circuit, or for those of you that are in a university sort of setting and trying to get into the job market here, having that like 4-year degree program and also working on hackathon projects, that sort of gets you a little bit of the teamwork skills as well as the practical sort of technology skills that are used on the actual job in the real world, and actually be able to show that you're building stuff. That complements really well sort of together there. And that's why I find that a lot of the people that have applied for job opportunities, not only here at Stack Overflow, but in other places, benefit a lot from than just having someone who's just doing their CS degree, for example, or just being self-taught and not doing anything else there. It's actually better to have a little bit of diversity in terms of the different things that you can do there. And not only that, but the hackathons directly may actually get you the dev opportunities. There are a lot of hackathons out there, at least when I was sort of really involved in this, where if you were building a really great project, part of the prize was to get an interview, or at the very least get a exposure to the right recruiters there. And even just being part of the hackathon circuit, where there are a lot of companies that are really interested in getting to know you, even if you don't win, just being involved in that community where you have a stronger network and you're able to talk to other recruiters and other people that are, companies that are thinking about recruiting. That's why they're there. So definitely take advantage of it. All right, last question here. Can we connect with you on LinkedIn? Short answer, yes, absolutely. You can find me on basically on all socials. So I'm just John, Jon, and then H as in horse, M as in mother, and then Chan, Chan, on all socials. So you can find me on LinkedIn that way. And yeah, you can also feel free to reach out to me whenever you'd like. So I'm just John at stackoverflow.com. Probably the easiest thing that you can remember.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sean. This has been really, really insightful. I loved all of the questions that came in and everything that all the wisdom you had to impart on everyone. We do have another stream starting. Any question that you wanted to answer that didn't come up, or any kind of final words of advice you'd like to leave Global Hack Week hackers with?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Mary, and all of you for being so engaged on this live stream over here. Really, the sort of parting words that I would have here is that we would love to have all of you get more involved with Stack Overflow sort of overall, not only with sort of like the student ambassador programs and the partnerships that we're doing with Major League Hacking and Global Hack Week, but even just getting involved in Stack Overflow, right? Like Stack Overflow is only possible because of all the participation that developers like you are having on the platform here. And as you all know, the technology world is changing a lot here. And so when we're looking to see how we're going to evolve as a community, as a product, we're looking to all of you to help us take us there.
Amazing. Cool. Well, the thank yous are flooding in. So seriously, thank you so much for joining. We have some fans from your booth at HackCon as well.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Yes, have a good one.